So, do you know what an estate planning session is? Do you know the importance of going through an estate planning session? Do you know the effects of you not going through an estate planning session? Well, if you answered no to any of these questions, I suggest you stick around so that we can have a discussion, right? Now, the reason why I want us to talk about this, or I am posing these questions, is simply because I've noted two things. First thing is that a lot of people are dying without a will. And what's happening is that they're not even going through an estate planning session and they are leaving a terrible mess behind for their beneficiaries. Second thing I've noted, some people die with wills, but then never attending any estate planning session and also are leaving a terrible mess behind for their beneficiaries. Now, I want us to talk about this. I want us to talk about the importance of an estate planning session and the benefits that it has for you and your family. So without further ado, let's get into the discussion. But before we do so, to all those that are new here, my name is Yolanda Mnyangeza and I'm an attorney and a director at Mnyangeza Attorneys. We hope that you will come back because we are about educating the masses. Let's get to the discussion. Now let's start with the first question here. What is an estate planning session? Now, an estate planning session is obviously that meeting you're going to have where you're going to talk about your financial affairs. Put down your debts, put down your assets, everything that concerns you. So why are you putting these things down? What are you going to talk about here? So what's going to happen is that we're going to assess what's your situation currently. Are you over indebted? Do you have debts that need to be settled? If, for instance, you were to pass away tomorrow, how can we ensure that those debts are fully paid for? Your assets, what's the value of those assets so that we understand what the prospective taxes are, so that we know what you need to prepare so that by the time you pass away, everything is going to be settled and in accordance. Right? So in a nutshell, that's what an estate planning session is. The estate planning session is important so that when you pass away, there aren't any debts lingering that your family doesn't know how to settle. It's important in a sense that we want to make sure that when you pass away, the assets you have, your family doesn't lose them because of creditors being owed. You get what I'm saying? The other important aspect is that this estate planning session ensures that we advise you on some of the things that you can take up to avoid paying certain taxes. Because when you reach a certain level in terms of, your financial assets, you will pay certain taxes to the taxman. So we try to set up a plan to ensure that when you pass away, your estate is going to pay very minimal costs. And another thing, or another aspect that's important about estate planning is that we want you to be able to save up the necessary funds your family will need. And I will tell you why they will need those funds. So that if something happens to you, they don't have to run around and be stressed about how they're going to pay for the necessary things that need to be paid for. So that in a nutshell is an estate planning session. It's meant to ensure that the transition from your death to your family inheriting everything and moving forward with their lives is seamless and is not complicated and stressful. Now, from that discussion alone, I'm sure we've seen what the benefits of an estate planning session is. Your family is going to retain all of the financial assets that you've worked for. Your family is never going to have to stress about the debt you've left behind. And thirdly, if there are costs that need to be paid for whatever it is, the necessary administration costs, you know that at least your family will have access to money to say to a lawyer, you know what, start the administration process. These are the funds. So there is nothing that will stop them from doing so. Remember, when your family doesn't have the necessary finances to carry out the administration of the estate, there's nothing that can be done on that estate. And that tends to be problematic because transfers cannot be done. Certain monies will not be released to your family. So all of this becomes a problem for your family. So they need to have cash up front to start the administration process so that everything can be released. So what are the effects of you not going through an estate planning session? Well, I think you would have noted some of these from the discussion, we just had. But in case you didn't, I'm going to specifically note the disadvantages of you not going through an estate planning session and how it affects your family. First things first, with regards to the debt that you have, remember the debt needs to be settled. So if you don't have a plan as to how these debts are going to be settled, likelihood is that your family will have to find a way to try and pay for these debts. And if they don't have actual cash, or your estate doesn't have liquidity enough to settle those debts, then there's going to be a problem, because what that will mean is that your assets will have to be sold for those debts to be paid. Whatever it is, whether it's the only property or the only house and home you have for your kids, doesn't matter. It will have to be sold so that those debts can be paid. Now, the second thing that could happen as a consequence if you don't go through an estate planning session is that your family could end up losing some of the assets that you thought you were leaving behind. Remember what I said. Some people tend to think that they have financial assets, whereas in that financial asset, there is a debt attached to it, which could end up making your family lose that particular asset. What am I speaking about here? Talking about people who have cars that they're still paying for, talking about people who have homes that are still mortgaged. Those kinds of assets, as much as you might look at them as assets, they are still debts. And so if you don't have a plan as to how they're going to be settled when you pass away, big problem, because what's going to happen is that the creditor is going to take it back and sell it, and then your family loses it. Then the third thing that happens as a consequence if you don't go through an estate planning session and draft a proper plan for yourself is that your family is not going to have enough money to pay for administration costs, right? As soon as your family or you pass away, your family has to cough up money and go pay an attorney to administer your estate. Now, if there's no money in that estate, where do you expect your family to gather it from? More especially if you were the breadwinner, where would you expect them to gather this money from? For example, a minimum of 10,000 will have to be paid towards administration costs when you pass away. And that is when you have things of a minimal value of, let's say, 251,000 rand. Anything from 8,000 to 10,000 is what your family will have to have, right? And that is money that they probably will not have. So when you go through an estate planning session, you get an opportunity as to how you can prepare and plan for this amount so that your family doesn't struggle when you pass away. And then the fourth thing that could happen as a consequence if you don't go through an estate planning session, again, is that you could end up, or your estate could end up paying a lot in taxes. Like I said, when you get to a certain threshold in South Africa, there's a certain tax or taxes that are applicable that your estate must pay. For example, there's taxes or a tax called the estate duty tax, which is one of the most expensive taxes that deceased estates have to pay, right? Now, just imagine this. You have properties that actually make up the value of your estate, but there is no money. Now, imagine the taxman saying your estate needs to pay this amount in taxes. Where are you expecting your family to gather that money from? Because remember, your value is made up of actual assets and not actual liquidity. So do you see where the danger is of you not going through an estate planning session? You don't get to see and understand the prospective costs, and you don't get to put a plan in place as to how you're going to gather this money so that if something happens to you, your family can then be able to settle those kinds of costs. And also, the fifth consequence, I have to say, of you not going through an estate planning session is that you're going to draft a will that doesn't make any sense. Like I said to you, there's people that have drafted wills, but whatever it is that they've drafted, because it doesn't speak to their financial assets and what these people are, it goes sideways. It goes completely sideways. For example, somebody would bequeath certain things to certain people, etc., and in a certain way. But then there would be all of these debts and these other things that are looming, which then tend to confuse the whole thing. So you need to go through an estate planning session, and I always encourage that you do this even before you draft your will, so that your will can speak to what you have and what your current stance is. Otherwise, you're going to make a very big mistake in your will, and this is just going to invalidate that whole process, right? So that brings us to the end of our discussion today, and I hope this was actually useful to you. Listen, if you found it useful, it's always helpful to actually pass it on to another person, whether you pass on the link or the actual video, whatever the case is. Just make sure you pass it on to another person, because we want them to also be educated just like you. So we'll see you next time. Thank you for being here. My name is Yolanda Mnyengeza, and I'm an attorney and a director at Mnyengeza Attorneys. We will see you next time.